Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. In this video, I really hope to implore upon you how much it would mean if you could help me to get some help with student debt. You see, I'm a professor, and one of the things I'm trying to teach my students right now is the just power of collective action, especially when geared with tools that we all have, such as um, things like the internet, right? Like I have these tools available to me, and how can I leverage those tools and our communities to help make the world a better place? And in order to help show that, I'm asking you guys to help me with a problem that I have and that my community has at a larger scale, and that is my problem with my student debt. So you might be asking yourself, why should you help me with student debt? And I get it. It seems like it's a me problem, and now I'm placing it on you. But I hope to show you that really this problem is a we problem, not a me problem. And by that I just mean over the years, we have been led to believe things that are not necessarily true, particularly when it comes to higher ed and student debt. And I hope to show you that it is worthwhile to spend a little bit of money. And if you only give a dollar, if I can get 100,000 people to give a dollar, then the student debt will be remedied. And for any dollar I collect over that amount, I promise to pledge to a scholarship program at my university that actually helps put first generation students in college at no cost. So that's the cause that we're hopefully gearing up for. And I hope to show you guys exactly how meaningful it might be. And so we're going to start by talking about my grandparents and understanding who they were and where they came from. And the reason I get it, why were we talking about your grandparents? Well, this is where the story starts. The story starts with the greatest generation, my grandparents' generation. Both my grandparents were born in the 20s and lived through the Depression. They were children in the Depression. In fact, I still remember watching my grandmother make sandwiches in my mother's house where it would be bread like wheat and tomatoes, cheese, lettuce, mayo, mustard, pickles, onions, peanut butter, jelly, jam, sour cream, anything that was in the fridge. And I remember asking her, Grandma, why are you doing that? And she's like, well, in the Depression, we didn't have options. And so just because if there's food in the fridge, you really should eat it. My other grandmother came from England. Well, she would correct me. She would say, Trevor, I'm a Kiwi. She was born in New Zealand, again in the 1920s, and her family moved from New Zealand to Sussex. And she would tell me stories about standing in her family farmhouse and watching the V2s fly over her house on their way to London. And I was like, Grandma, that's not a normal story. Both my grandparents became single mothers very early on. My grandmother and my dad moved from Boston, Massachusetts to Huntington Beach. My grandmother with my mom, she moved around the Midwest a lot until she found her place in Orange County as well, where they met. Now, why do they matter so much? Well, it all comes back to understanding who they were, because the beginning logic of student loan debt begins with them. Up until that time, only rich people could go to college. If you studied the GI Bill, which my grandfather had, you start to understand how they got these ideas about funding higher ed. They thought anyone could go to college, and we need a much more intelligent workforce. And so my grandparents scrimped and saved and did everything they could to ensure that my parents could go to college. And my parents largely went on their own because my grandparents were blue-collar people. My grandfather, who isn't really my grandfather, I keep saying grandfather, but it's just because he's the only person I ever knew as a grandfather. But he worked for Ford for 40 years. And my grandmother worked wherever, both my grandmothers worked wherever they could. One of my grandmothers was a school aide in Huntington Beach, California. I don't know how she made it. If you ever want to see sort of economic disparity, understand that my grandmother in 1950 could afford to live in Huntington Beach, California, while working as a low-level school administrator for an elementary school as a single mom. I don't think that's possible today. But that gets us to the larger story of how my grandparents were really gearing my parents up to be very successful. And my parents were successful. Both of them at least started college. I'm not really sure what my father's eventual end game was. I honestly don't even know if he has a degree or not. My mother is a registered nurse. She got her AA in nursing. I believe she got a different degree before that. And her degree was largely paid for by the state. And again, I think that's very important because between my grandmother getting married and having kids for the first time to my mother going to college in the 70s, this is what their world and income looked like. After the war, in real wages, their starting wage was $10 an hour. And in the 30 years after the war, they immediately got to what we would consider today to be $20 an hour. And you can see it on this graph. You see the federal minimum wage really doesn't do much after that. Both in real and in actual federal minimum wage terms, there isn't a whole lot of growth. And so we can start to understand why they believed college was so affordable. They were on the upswing of this curve. They were making more money than their parents and their grandparents did. And then it plateaus with my parents' generation. If this graph were to continue, we probably wouldn't have a student loan debt problem today, but it stopped. And if you notice between 1972 and 2009, in real dollars, we didn't even get a dollar raise at the low end of the spectrum. And why does that matter for most of us? Even though we're not minimum wage employees, it matters for most of us because our wage is determined by minimum wage. So many times we'll read in our articles and in newspapers and on TV that burger flippers don't deserve $15 an hour, but by this measure, a burger flipper in 1945 would be making $19 an hour in 2009 dollars. And so we need to understand that the student loan crisis began because we stopped paying wages. Our wages stagnated. They stopped growing. And as you see on the bottom part of the graph, in terms of actual real wages and wages that we felt, we see throughout the 80s a decline in minimum wage. What's interesting to me, and this came from a libertarian in Minnesota, is that we can federally mandate how little a person can make every hour, but we don't mandate how much they can make. And a lot of people say, well, that's socialist, but it's just as socialist to say how little we can pay and make. And so if we're going to have a minimum wage, there's a big question about whether or not we should have a maximum wage. But I just wanted to show you this graph to help you understand why it's a we problem, that we haven't seen growth in our wages. It isn't a you versus me problem. It's an us versus them problem. Our wages haven't grown in 40 years. Not really. But our student debt has. And so as you see the generations change, you can start to understand why my parents may not have understood what was happening to us. They may not have understood that one of the issues we were facing was our money wasn't growing the way their money did. When my parents graduated from college, they had some of the highest starting wages because that's when minimum wage was at its peak. And then it was all downhill. So here we can actually start to see in different ways how much we've fallen behind. From 1968 and 2018 dollars all the way to 2018 dollars today, we've actually seen a decrease. It's not even flat. It's gone down. And so how can any of us, me, your kids, your nieces, your nephews, your grandchildren. How can any of us really expect to be able to pay off a debt that is ever increasing when our wages don't increase with it? We're really in a whirlpool of debt now. And I know what you're thinking. Well, maybe the colleges didn't get expensive. But the truth of the matter is, the colleges got more expensive. Here's the same time frame. 1972, my family could go to college, average at less than $10,000 a year. But since then, we're paying 1.5 times that amount every year. So hopefully you can understand why somebody like me would really ask somebody like you to help. And unlike other people in our country who would love to ask you for money even though they don't need it, and as much as I would love to ask for money and be able to just put it in my savings account, as we have seen other people do recently, I really just want to pay off this debt, and then I want to help others pay off their debts. So if you have anything that you're willing to help others with, I ask that you consider to help us. Because it isn't a you problem, and it isn't a me problem. It is a we problem.